A precarious international status for the Chagos Islands keeps thousands displaced and asylum seekers stranded. For more than 50 years, the indigenous inhabitants of the Indian Ocean archipelago have fought to return home, evicted under ambiguous terms after the U.S. built a military base on Diego Garcia Island. Meanwhile, dozens of mostly Tamil asylum seekers languish on the British Indian Ocean territory under conditions even the Foreign Office admits are not suitable. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the Chagos Islands. For years, the displacement of the Chagossian Islanders flew mostly under the human rights radar, forcibly evicted and moved thousands of miles away, primarily to Mauritius and the Seychelles. They say they were given little support and left to fend for themselves in an ongoing case of colonial-era human rights violations. Today, though, their case is being re-examined by human rights groups and the United Nations, and the Indigenous Islanders hope they may be closer to returning home. Here's a look.
These islands are the last British territory in the Indian Ocean. 58 years ago, the UK and the US agreed to build a military base on Diego Garcia, the largest island of the Chagos archipelago. The UK separated the islands from Mauritius and created a new colony called the British Indian Ocean Territory. This was done to bypass the UN safeguards for indigenous people under colonial rule. It also falsely reported that Chagos had no permanent residents when it was home to around 1,500 indigenous people for centuries. The UK forcibly removed them between 1968 and 1973, and now only British and American personnel live there.
One day, the administrator called us. They told us, "You have to evacuate the island now." We had to go. We had no choice. That is how we left. We were not allowed to take a lot with us. Just one suitcase, one box, some clothes, and a mattress. Nothing else. We were not even allowed to take cooking tools. Nothing else.
Chagossians fled to Mauritius and Seychelles. They received some compensation from the British government, but it wasn't enough to stop them from falling into abject poverty. For years, the islanders have been fighting to return home. In 2017, the Mauritius government took the UK to the International Court of Justice, and The Hague urged an end to the unlawful British occupation.
The United Kingdom is under an obligation to bring an end to its administration of the Chagos archipelago as rapidly as possible, thereby enabling Mauritius to complete the decolonization of its territory.
Finally, after ignoring the ruling for years, the British government agreed in November 2022 to negotiate with Mauritius. But in January, Foreign Secretary David Cameron stunned the Chagossians by saying a return was now not possible.
The absolutely crucial thing is the safety, security, long-term viability of this base in a difficult and dangerous world. And anything that gets in the way of that is a major problem.
Responding to the comments, Human Rights Watch sent an open letter to Cameron urging the UK to end its ongoing crimes against humanity. But the UK and US say the military base is vital for their security interests as China is expanding its influence in the Indian Ocean. They fear Beijing could fill their shoes in the region. But the Chagossians say they don't want the base to be closed, but to resettle in the vacant parts of the islands which were stolen from them decades ago.
Now, there's another issue on the largest Chagossian island of Diego Garcia, where people not associated with the military are living in reportedly dangerous conditions. Dozens of Sri Lankan Tamil asylum seekers have fallen into a gray zone where the Refugee Convention does not apply. The UK doesn't want them brought to Britain, but says it's been looking for a third country to transfer them to under yet another legally questionable asylum policy. Well, joining me now to talk about what they're up against is journalist Jacob Goldberg. He's been investigating their plight for the new Humanitarian, and he joins us now from Bangkok. Jacob, thanks so much for being with us. So first tell us a little bit about the story of these asylum seekers, how they ended up in this kind of no man's land for refugees, and what kind of conditions are they facing now?
They arrived in late 2021. They are fleeing persecution based on their Tamil ethnicity by the Sri Lankan government. This persecution has been going on for decades during the civil war that lasted almost 2 decades, and even to this day. And they felt like they had no choice but to flee. They got on a boat from southern India and were hoping to make it to Canada. And their boat started to break down close to Diego Garcia, where British forces rescued them. And many of them have been trapped there ever since.
And what are the conditions like then on the island?
There's around 60 asylum seekers still on the island. Many have left. They couldn't bear the conditions. And those who are still there, they say that the conditions are unbearable. They say that they've been bullied by G4S security guards. They say that the food is inadequate. They say that there's basically no point being alive because there's absolutely nothing to do there. They're confined to an enclosed camp. They live in tents that are infested with rats. And their mental health is deteriorating, and the recent report by UNHCR said that the conditions they amount to abuse by the UK, which is responsible for their protection.
So, I mean, what should the UK and the US actually be doing by law to protect or help them?
The legal situation is actually tied to the colonial history of the island. The reason the island falls in a gray zone is because the UK maintains that the Refugee Convention doesn't apply there. And the reason that they say it doesn't apply there is because the Refugee Convention only came into effect after the territory was created, and therefore it doesn't apply there. And because of that legal loophole, they say that they have no obligation to let these asylum seekers come to the UK, which would be their obligation under the convention.
So do they want to be, have they told you they want to be transferred anywhere? You said some of them have left already. Explain how they left and where they went. And for the others, do they want to be transferred? Would that be better to go to Rwanda or another third country?
They all maintain that they want to go to a safe country. For a lot of them, that means coming to the UK, which the authorities of the British Indian Ocean Territory have said won't be possible. They actually made a change in the constitution of the territory after the asylum seekers arrived to make sure that that would not be allowed. The circumstances of asylum seekers leaving, the UK says that's voluntary, but again, the conditions on the island were unbearable, and some of them just felt like they couldn't wait any more years to figure out where they were going to end up.
Okay, Jacob Goldberg, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Now back to the Indigenous Chagossian Islanders' fight for their right to return. Only a tiny handful have even ever been allowed to visit since they were forcibly removed half a century ago. So is the UK violating international law by keeping them out? Joining me now to debate that are, from Crawley in the UK, the spokesperson for Chagossian Voices, Frankie Bontemps. From Norwich, chairman of the Freedom Association and former Conservative MEP David Campbell Bannerman. And from London, Clive Baldwin is a senior legal advisor at Human Rights Watch. Thanks all so much for being with me. Frankie, I'll begin with you and tell us why you and your fellow Chagossians are actually fighting for the right to return. It's been almost 60 years, but apparently your diaspora has never quite felt settled anywhere else.
Yeah, because like the Chagossian, like on the Chagos, we were perhaps a small community, but we were a peaceful and very close community. And, since the forced exile, like myself, I was born in Mauritius. My mom was born on the Chagos, on the main island, which is Diego Garcia. And they keep on telling, about it was a simple life, but a stress-free life. That's why like myself, lots of Chagossian, even descendant, like we want to relive those memories. Like myself, if I had the opportunity to go back, I will go back straight away. And I think that even the next generation, like even my son, there's still this will, like for us to connect to, what been lost. Like for us, the Chagos is like it's a paradise that's been
Okay.
lost.
But I mean,
Yes.
okay, I'm going to be slightly cynical here. I mean, first of all, explain, Mauritius is still a lovely island. There's a lot more development there. So why isn't Mauritius why has it never felt quite like home to you? And also, what if you do go back to the Chagos Islands and it's not the simple life that your family had once valued? It often happens that, places are idealized once someone's been out for a long time, and then the reality on the ground can be quite different. Do you fear that?
Yes, of course. But to come back to first part of the question about Mauritius, Chagossian has never feel like at home in Mauritius, because like the Chagossian, if you look at the heart of the Chagossian story, the Chagossian are the sole victim, because we were sacrificed for Mauritius independence and for the defense purposes of the Western world. And what did the Chagossian get in return? Nothing. They've been kicked out from our homeland. We've been living in exile for the last 60 years. And even in Mauritius, we were often treated like second-class citizens. That's why we don't feel at home, even in Mauritius or in the UK as well. So for us, the ideal thing is to go back to the Chagos. Of course, we can't expect the life that our forefathers were living there, because everything changed now. There's no coconut plantation as there was 60 years ago. But there should be more opportunities for us, like to perhaps develop fishing industry, fishing on a small scale, like ecotourism. And we're living in the 21st century. There should be some stuff like we could be self-sustainable, like thing that we could work with. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see it kind of redeveloped along more traditional lines that you remember your family experiencing. But let me turn to Clive, because I need to ask you if all of it sounds realistic to you, and if they have the right to be returned to these islands, given what's there now, i.e. the military base, and the security issues involved with that, for example. And under international law, must the UK simply allow them to return?
The simple answer is yes. The Chagossians are the indigenous people of the Chagos archipelago, and they were forcibly and unlawfully displaced by the United Kingdom, the colonial power, with the United States, which wanted its base on Diego Garcia 50, 60 years ago. And that's actually a crime against humanity. Forced displacement is a crime against humanity. And prevention of return of a people is a crime against humanity as well. So the right to return of a people to their homeland is quite clear. And on the practical side, most of the islands are abandoned because the islanders were forced off. The military base on Diego Garcia is taking up a third to a half of the land, and people vary on that. But the Chagossians have said they want to move back to the unoccupied areas. There's none of the Chagossians my organization has interviewed want the base to close. They want to be able to work there as part of their way of life. So the duty on the UK, especially the US, which may be preventing return to Diego Garcia, and on Mauritius, if they get any form of control over the islands to allow return, is there. But it's also, this is an issue of reparations, and reparations is putting right harms that have been done. And here it's very clear what reparations mean. It means the right to return, but it also means the UK with the US making sure the islands are livable again and the Chagossians can have a sustainable future there.
Okay, let me turn to David, because David, you seem to believe this is a lot more complicated than just human rights law dictating that forcibly removed people have the right to go back. There is this US military base there that we may not hear a lot about, but it is highly strategic. And you believe it will likely become more strategic and more sensitive, which is what, not conducive to rehoming residents?
Yeah, I should say straight away, Andrea, that I'm very sympathetic to the people. I think it was awful that they were moved forcibly. I think it's about 2,000 were there that were moved forcibly back in the late 60s, early 70s. But we have to deal with the situation now. And as you say, this is a very important base. It's strategic between Africa, across the Indian Ocean, obviously, it covers to the Far East. And I know it was involved, for example, in liberating Kuwait, in bombing Afghanistan under the Taliban there, and probably more recently, we don't know for sure, but involved in the Houthis, bombing the Houthis who killed 3 sailors yesterday on a ship, and that's a major threat to international maritime trade. So I think it's a lot more complex. And of course, the human rights of other people, especially those, the sailors and those in the region, the Middle East, need to be considered as well. So I think it's a lot more complex than is made out here.
Okay. Well, then let me come back to Clive quickly, because if it is a militarily sensitive area and that highly strategic, as David was claiming, David, I remember you'd also made mention much earlier about the risk going forward with China and how important that base is going to be. Something the US and the UK wouldn't be willing to sacrifice, nor would their populations, or compromise on. So,
I mean, yeah.
well, go ahead.
Our Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, has made it clear, obviously the world faces some very great threats at the moment. It's a very dangerous time, not just obviously Ukraine, but what about Taiwan being attacked? And again, Diego Garcia with its long-range bombers, B-52s, etc., is very important to that, to responding to aggression from China, not just what's happening in the Middle East and the wider implications there. So I'm worried about, there is a balance of rights here, obviously, but I'm worried about, this is basically one great security site now, whether we like it or not. And it's very, very important, particularly at this point in world history, unfortunately.
Okay, so Clive, let me ask you about that then. If it is what David says it is, I mean, can it be compatible with a returning residential population? And if not, then is there another way to compensate the Chagossian Islanders?
Sure. I mean, it's to say that the reason the base is there is because the US and UK secretly planned in the 1960s to evacuate not just the population of Diego Garcia Island, but the entire population of the archipelago. And many of the islands are hundreds of kilometers away from the base on Diego Garcia. And they did that to avoid reporting to the United Nations about a continuing rule over population. So it was done on the basis of lies. But what means today is that, as we said, the base on Diego Garcia, none of the Chagossians want that to close. It's just to be able to live in their homeland again. And those are perfectly compatible rights. There are many UK and US military bases around the world where the military bases are large, sensitive, and the local population live right next door, whether we're talking the Falkland Islands, Cyprus, bases within the United States itself, in the Pacific Ocean as well. So these are perfectly compatible. It would be a matter, though, for the US, UK, with Mauritius actually talking to the Chagossian population, involving them in the decisions about their future, which has been ignored for the last 60 years. And for your last question, reparations, they mean everything, putting things right, ensuring the Chagossians who wish to return to live, not everyone will, can return, and everyone else gets full, adequate compensation for all the harm they've been suffering for 60 years.
And Clive, is it all about money? Reparations mean, big payouts. Is that what's driving this?
No, it's a mixture. Is that reparations means putting right what was done. And reparations can include finances, but it's for, as you said, it was 2,000 or more Chagossians 60 years ago. The descendants today are some thousands of people. You're not talking millions of people. But this is one of the situations of reparations where the UK and US tomorrow could put things right in a way which hasn't been done before. Both the UK and US have said that they deeply regret what was done to the Chagossians, but they still haven't put right what was done.
Let me come back to Frankie then. Because there's another argument out there that people argue the Chagossians were actually compensated by being offered UK citizenship, and that, you know, people around the world will go to very desperate lengths to get that kind of passport. We see people dying in the waters around the UK trying to get there, and they say that was handed to the Chagossians or to, well, Mauritius, where you grew up, and that should simply be enough. You have other opportunities. And now, given the security issues around this military base and all the complications that go with that, Chagossians should settle for what they have. What do you think?
No, that's not right. It's not fair. How can a passport can suddenly like compensate all the suffering that our people have been through for the last 60 years? And like myself, as I said earlier, I can give back this passport to go back to live on Diego Garcia, because I can't see like the Chagossian themselves a security threat to the base. There are lots of civilians living near to military base all around the world, and we are not against like closing this base. We want to live. I want to live there, even the base is there. I commit and to get like a opportunity for a job, for example. And like myself, my main concern is not like to live here in the UK. I think, as Clive mentioned earlier, it's time for the UK government and the US to take responsibility. You can't, like, every time say you have deep regrets, what's been done is wrongful, but what are you doing actually to correct this injustice? Nothing. You know, even the US government been saying like, okay, we are just leasing the island, you have to look for the owner, which is the UK. But when one other thing that I wanted to mention, when the UK take possession of the island, the Chagossian was living there, and they still keep the fiction like Chagossian are not indigenous people, like Chagossian are contractual, Mauritius contractual worker. So for the last 180 years, we have like 6 or 7 generations of Chagossian who've been living on this island, and we consider ourselves like indigenous people of the island. But no, the UK or Mauritius, they want to admit this because they know at the end, if they recognize us as such, we will have a right to self-determination on the land, on the island.
Yeah.
And that's what we're fighting for, you know?
Let me ask David, though, because David, you've argued before that Chagossians actually don't have the right to say they are indigenous in the first place. They may have been the permanent population that the UK lied about, but why don't you think they should necessarily claim indigenous rights?
I'm just looking at the history of it, which is quite interesting. It was French colonialists that brought people from India and Africa to colonize the Chagos Islands, and that's how it started. And then, of course, Britain took over the islands under the Treaty of Paris in 1814, which was after Napoleon. So it was all tied in a lot of the big powers, Austria, Russia, signed up to it. And it's the same history as the Mauritius, as looking at. It was the same, Treaty of Paris. But I believe Britain actually paid, I don't know if Clive knows, but I think we actually paid for the Chagos Islands the right to keep it after we gave independence to Mauritius. So, as I say, it's quite an interesting historical story here. And I've got a huge amount of sympathy to Frankie there and to the people. I can understand the situation, but I think at this particular time, it's a very sensitive time in terms of security. I'm not saying, obviously, Frankie would not be, very much on the side of the West, I'm sure, but it is a sensitive time, and it's basically like inviting a group of people, citizens, into a military base is what the proposition is now. It shouldn't have been like that. Those rights should have been respected back in the 60s, 70s. But the situation now, I think, is more complex.
Okay, let me get a question in with Clive, though, because if their dreams are realized to return home, and Human Rights Watch champions their cause, and they do go back, and they begin to face the reality of there being no development on really any of these islands apart from what is at that military base, then you also have these very low-lying islands in the Indian Ocean that might be particularly vulnerable to climate change. What would have to be done in that case to protect these people that the international community would pretty much be responsible for helping to care for?
Yeah. About 10 years ago, the British government, actually David Cameron was Prime Minister then, set up a review of the treatment of Chagossians, and they commissioned the organisation KPMG to do a survey of whether return of the Chagossians to live was feasible, and KPMG found it was. Maximum it would cost, they say, hundreds of millions to restore the islands of British pounds. They say it was probably lower than that at that time. And that included considering issues about global warming, rising sea levels, which may affect Chagos less than some of the other islands. But still, that would go to that issue of reparations, that sort of one-off, making sure the islands are, that the Chagossians are able to live there and then can develop, as Frankie was saying, ecotourism, some fishing. The Chagossians also say they want to respect the protections that are already in place for the environment.
Okay.
So it is feasible in that way, and it's been set out even 10 years ago.
Right. Clive, that will unfortunately have to be the final word for this edition of The Newsmakers. Fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.